Okay. Should we go ahead and get started, or do we want to wait another second? I think it's already a minute after.
I think it's a great time to get started if you're ready.
I think so, yeah. So if you want to go ahead, Megan, with the various introductions you wanted to do.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Megan Carter. I'm ESIP's Community Director, and I'm here in a support role today, like I do fill with all of ESIP's collaboration areas. I'm extremely excited about this new ESIP cluster. In particular, physical samples are especially dear to my heart. But what I want to tell you before we get started, since this is the first session of the 2021 ESIP Winter Meeting post-plenary, I just want to remind you that you are in Zoom right now. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a toolbar, and this is the place you can find the participant window, the chat button, the share screen if you're a presenter. We will have some breakout sessions later, and that's where you'll find the opportunity to select which one you'd like to be in. If you have questions at any time, feel free to pop them into the chat box. Please mute when you're not speaking. Cameras on during discussion, off when somebody's presenting, generally just to save a little bit of bandwidth. And then remember that you can switch between gallery and speaker view. If you have any questions, again, chat box. The ESIP community takes very seriously the behaviors of our community participants. We have outlined very clearly in our community participation guidelines what behaviors we expect and welcome and those that we will not tolerate. At the top of the notes document for every breakout session you'll see at this meeting is a link to our full community participation guidelines and also a link that shows you how to report. So please know that those are there and do contact the staff if you have any questions, or any of actually the volunteer leaders, the members of the board as well are ambassadors of those guidelines. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sarah and Val.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our kickoff meeting. This is really exciting for us. We first pitched this idea last summer to have a physical samples cluster, and thanks to all the hard work of all of you, we developed a cluster statement, which was approved in the fall, and this is our first session. So we're super excited about this. Thanks for the applause. I see that in some of the comments. Before we get started, at the bottom of the slides is a link to the meeting notes that Megan referred to. If you go there, we ask that you please add your name and affiliation to the top of the meeting notes document, just to check in, and so we have a record so we can contact anyone after this session if needed. And then also, if anyone wants to help, if you scroll down on page 2, I highlighted it in red just to make it stand out a bit better, is where Val's going to be capturing some notes, but we please encourage anyone else to help along with that process. Sometimes it can be hard to lead a session and moderate and try and take notes all at the same time. Let me get back, there we go. And so now let's take a look at the agenda. First, we're going to do some introductions, which we've already sort of halfway through. Then we're going to have Shelley give a presentation on FAIR. Then we're going to go into some breakout activities, specifically designed to look at what activities this cluster might work on moving forward. We've got some seed topics which we'll present, and then we'll see if there's others that might want to be included as well, and then we'll go off into groups. We'll come back, we'll report the outcomes, and then we'll, as a group, discuss those findings. And then we've got some wrapping up points as well. And also feel free to interrupt at any time with any questions for those of you who are new. The introduction here, I'm being very brief on this, mostly because we covered a lot of this information in the summer session last year, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time rehashing some of these topics. But really, this community is about physical samples. And this quote, while it's focused on the geosciences, is really applicable to many different domains that are covered within the ESIP community and that we hope to include in this physical samples cluster. But this idea that the preservation of these physical samples, the data, the collections around them, they're really important, and it's both in the present and in the future that they'll be important to us. And so we want to do what we can now to help ensure their longevity. And a lot of those actions are centered around curation, which is preservation of the data, of the samples themselves, of the related materials, of the connections to those related materials, and also providing access to those materials. And it's really that life cycle of the sample data along the way from collecting it into the field, bringing it into the lab for analysis, any sort of write-up, and then providing access to someone else by putting it into a repository, publishing it, and then maybe even coming back into and revisiting that again with either maybe from another domain, another perspective, but along the way, keeping track of all of that information and providing access to it.
Sarah, could I just interrupt for one sentence?
Yeah.
When I say repository, or when we say repository, like realizing that there are both physical and digital entities there that we're talking about for the data, as well as where the physical sample resides.
And also that it doesn't have to be a formal repository. I think that's important too, is that small science individuals who have materials in their lab or their office and might not have a formal repository to deposit things in, but still want to keep track of that life cycle, it's equally as a valid and important perspective to think about as well.
Absolutely.
So having a community of people interested in that topic, but not quite having a home, brought us to have the session last summer at ESIP to say, well, let's form a cluster so we can have these conversations together. And a lot of it came from the idea of reviewing existing tools and services that were already created so that we can share them within new community spaces or to new researchers or new curators, but also to not necessarily redo stuff that had already been done, but just to increase awareness of them. We also wanted to talk about maybe streamlining some workflows, especially between different repositories as they do similar tasks and share data between them. There might be ways to improve that. And then also we wanted to connect with other organizations and groups that were working on similar topics to make sure, again, that we're aware of things on a national level, an international level, and also across different domains. And so we have things like GBIF, which is biological data. We've got RDA, which is an international community. So there's different places we wanted to make sure we were making connections with. And you can review the resulting cluster statement. It's at the bit.ly link at the top of the slides there. And I think it's also in the session description as well. But I won't go into a lot of detail because hopefully some of you have read that in advance of the meeting today. So from the cluster statement, we, I guess how that cluster statement was developed was we took the discussions from the summer meeting and the topics that were raised by the community as being important and relevant. And we were in some breakouts along those lines as well too. And we took all of that information and consolidated it into a cluster statement. And the potential working group topics that came out of that are what's here on the slide. And I'm sharing that as a focus point from the statement because it's going to go into our breakout activity later, that there are 4 major topic areas. Reviewing existing efforts or literature, metadata interoperability, resources and infrastructure, and identifiers and for effective linking and citations. And I won't read through this here because that's a lot of information, but it's here in the slides for background. So if you're in your breakout group, you want to refer back to it to get a general idea of what was done previously. And just keeping it on time, I think we're actually right on time now to transition into our presentation from Shelley. Any questions before we move into that? Okay. The teacher in me, it's always like, oh, so hard to have that big pause. Okay, but Shelley, if you're ready, I'll start advancing into your slides.
I am.
Okay.
So hi, everyone. I hope most of you know me, but if you happen to not know me, there's my orchid. How's that for an answer? American Geophysical Union, the Senior Director for Data Leadership, and just realized that when they picked that title, they meant very, very broadly things having to do with data and any other digital object. So, it's as broad as our universe. I won't talk about FAIR specifically, but I'll talk about what the culture is around sharing digital objects and what AGU's been up to, influenced by and influencing, and then where I think there's a really great connection to this particular cluster as you see fit. So next slide. We have a position statement. And it's been around since the late 90s, which is rather noteworthy when it comes to a society journal. And our data, as Sarah had noted in that report from some years back, is incredibly valuable. It's a World Heritage. That includes includes physical samples as well and all the related data. And this particular policy was just recently updated, and I think there's a very nice connection to physical samples in there, and it's updated every 5 years. Next slide. Things to tell you about. So the publishing community, STM, is one of several associations that publishers belong to. They identified 2020 as Research Data Year, and that was fantastic. Now, they're a little slow to come to this topic. You know, the geoscientists have been working on data sharing for some years now in partnership with ESIP and RDA and others. So it was a little humorous to watch them go, okay, we'll come help. So just know that I kept my snarky comments to myself. But this is really great because it's an international view that's coming, and they're pushing it very broadly, and they're building a dashboard, and they're talking about the importance of availability statements. They're slowly getting to the citation links, and oh, by the way, they figured out it would take longer than a year, and I hope you're all giggling because you knew that going in, right? But I'm on their steering committee, so this is just great stuff, and you know, they keep moving forward, and I keep pushing them, and so do others that are on our team. So just so you know. Okay, next slide. This is the open and available guidance that we give to our authors for data sharing, software sharing, and this is definitely an evolving space. I can't tell you how many times I've rewritten this as I think through and get informed conversations from others. And what I want to highlight for you in particular is you will, well, I'll tell you what, let's go forward one more slide. Just recently, we added this journal specific guidance. It's completed for 4 of our 22 journals. And I do have drafts of the rest. I'm paused on finishing them because it is if you navigate to this link, which I hope you will, because I think you'll see how important your cluster is. It's a very difficult document to maintain, and I'm trying to rethink how to do it before I finish 22, and then I have 22 to maintain instead of 4. Here's how this applies to you. You will be both horrified and delighted that, thanks Sarah, that physical samples has very little information here. Horrified because it should be here, delighted that I didn't write it without your help. So note the gap, note the ask. I really need help. I don't know quite what to say, and I certainly don't want to say it without your blessing and that of the community. And frankly, I think we probably need to think about this broadly, be outside just AGU, but take it to COPTAS. So next slide. Other things, we'll come back to that topic, other things that are happening. So beyond just data, we have work happening within software, trying to figure out how to give common guidance to authors. And note that this is a broad effort through Force 11, where we did invite the same working group that supported the Enabling Fair Data project for the publisher working group. If any of you remember that happening a couple years ago, we brought those same journals over to Force 11 to build this common author guidelines for software that literally just got published a few days ago. Finally, so we're pushing that out on the top. Feel free to take a look. There's also guidance for authors. There's guidance for developers, but this is specific for journals to put into their author guidelines. The next thing this task force is going to work on is the actual production issues around data and software citations. We threw data in because that's not going well either. And that's a whole other deep dive. We'll skip over the challenges there for the moment. Next slide. So also working broadly in the community outside of AGU, I got to co-chair an NIH working group on general repositories. So this was really a delight, and all of this is online. I think you can get to the workshop through the Zenodo connection, but one of the outputs was an updated generalist repository comparison chart. And there is a dynamic version on the Fair is Fair site, although we need the dynamic part to be a little bit better over time. They're updating their metadata. to allow that. But this is really helpful because it really kiboshes most authors' issues with size and costs. And you can just say, okay, listen, if that's not really true, here's the comparison chart. There is room for your data. Just because it's really big or just because you have no money doesn't mean you can't get it into a generalist repository. These are not optimal. We want domain repositories to be used first. We definitely want institutional repositories, and then last but not least, generalist repositories. So just realizing that we have these broad international efforts where we try to highlight challenges and build tools like this as a community. Next slide. Just yesterday, I kicked off this seminar series for societies on data sharing. Again, data, the big, digital, etc. And there is plenty of room to have an IGSN presentation, and this will actually start Friday next week. I will, once I hop off, I'll put the link to the promo on the left there, and you're welcome to share that with anyone you think would be interested. This is coming at the need for culture change for data sharing. It's not hitting FAIR straight on, but it does sidle up to it. It helps societies realize what their role is in highlighting what it means within disciplines. And this is discipline wide. It's not just the natural sciences, it's everybody. You can see who's been collaborating with us. And not all the logos showed up, but the words did, which is great. And I'm really delighted. There's a lot of excitement that there will be a series of speakers. So I put myself on as one of the first speakers because I didn't give my speakers much time to prepare. And I thought that would be mean, and I might as well take some of the responsibility myself, but I won't be one of the primary speakers. We'll bring in experts, and certainly speaking about persistent identifiers for physical samples would be an absolutely appropriate speaker sometime in the future. Next slide. So here's my turnaround of the talk. I need your help. Journals worldwide need your help. We don't really know what to say about physical samples. It's hard. Keep in mind, if you're a specialist in journals, you would definitely need to provide support to editors and staff at journals because we don't know the answers. And how does a journal link IGSNs to the data and to the paper? That's not clear. It's not a direct connection. You've got to go to the data first and then the paper, I think, but I really need you guys to tell us the answer to that. And wouldn't it be great to bring the journal community together to build that common author guidance? Of course, that would be something that would come from you, but AG would be happy to help convene and provide a platform to give you a space to do that. And we'd be happy to help. So there you are.
All right, so, well, that was perfect on time too. I was about to ask though, do we have any questions for Shelley before we move into the breakout groups?
Sarah, how do you want questions? You want a raised hand? You want?
Yeah, I say if you have a question, if you want to go right ahead and ask it. But yeah, if you either want to put something in the chat or raise your hand, I think Val's monitoring those and can call on folks.
I just had a brief comment. I mean, one thing is that this group is broader than IGSN, I think, and we need to take into consideration that there are other identifiers for samples, and the recommendations, I think, need to take that into account. I obviously strongly promote the IGSN, but I think we could cause problems, especially for any biological samples, if we stay narrowly focused on the IGSN.
Yet one more education piece for journals. We need to be educated on what those persistent identifiers are.
I'm adding some of these points to one of the breakout notes. Okay. So any other questions before we move on? Okay, well, thank you very much, Shelley. This was very informative. And one of the thoughts that we had, how do I mention, there we go, was that we wanted to bring in this concept of FAIR back into FAIR samples, into the discussion in order to facilitate our thinking around what activities this group might do. And so we thought this presentation might help set that stage and set the tone for the conversation.
Well, I didn't hit FAIR straight on, but if you are linking to your journal, then your sample can be found and discovered, potentially accessible. Proper metadata gets you more understanding for potential reuse, and then following a community standard gets you to interoperability. So in a nutshell, there's your FAIR.
Right. All right, so looking back over at our agenda, we're now going to move into the breakout activities. First, we're going to have a brief introduction into them, and then we're going to go into group for 25 minutes. And then when we come back, each group is going to give a very brief 3-minute report of what their group worked on. And then we're going to have a community discussion as a group to talk about the individual findings. So that just keep that in mind when we discuss the different groups, if there's more than one that you're interested in, it's okay. If you'll hear the report from the other group and still have a chance to weigh in at the end. Okay. So on this slide here, we've got the topics for the 3 breakout groups, and underneath each topic is a link to the set of slides that will be used to capture notes from each breakout group. We've proposed 3 topics. The first is a literature review and discussion of previous efforts. The second is on FAIR metadata for samples, and the third is linking and citations. And I'll be leading the third group, Val will be leading the first group, and Joan Damro will be leading the second group. And sorry, I realized we didn't introduce ourselves in the beginning, but you probably know us by now. If these groups are not exhaustive, we also can form a 4th group, just if needed. But I already feel like, based on even this presentation from Shelley, I can feel there's already a little bit of overlap between these topics. So there might not be necessary to have a 4th group. At this point too, when you're going to go into groups, Megan's going to set out breakout rooms already, so you don't have to rename yourself or let us know what group you prefer. You'll just be able to, once we're done reviewing the process for the breakout groups, you'll be able to click and go into the room.
So just 3, Sarah, that you decided, not 4?
Yeah, does anyone have any topic that they want to introduce as a potential breakout group?
Well, the only thing I could, that I feel missing a bit is the access to the physical samples at all. This seems to be very, focused on the digital side of the samples. I wonder if that's a topic you're planning for doing later.
Actually, resources and infrastructure was one of the main working group areas that we wanted to facilitate discussion on. We just hadn't had a chance to identify and develop a lead for that breakout. And I think, Alex, are you on? Alex Hengster volunteered to lead that group if needed. So if we think that there's enough people in the room today to break up into 4 groups, we could potentially have that 4th group be here. Would there be interest? I don't know if anyone wants to raise hands or just vocalize if we did open up a 4th group on that topic of the physical infrastructure for samples. Would anyone want to join that group?
Just from a size perspective, 4 groups would be great for this number of people, I would say. See a hand.
I think if there's not enough interest, then, just leave the existing groups.
Someone did raise their hand. I can't see what the name is, so if they want to speak up.
I saw 3 hands up plus Alex and Kirsten. I mean, that sounds to me like that would be.
Oh, I wasn't saying that. I'm definitely going to go into that group. That I can.
Yeah, I'll say, how about this, Megan, if you want to create that fourth
I did.
room.
It exists.
Okay.
It'll be there.
Yeah, and those of you who go in there, I'll make a copy of one of the other breakout group slides just for you to have, and I'll put it here in the chat, and then you can manipulate them as you want. And I'm going to, on the next slide, review what each group is going to talk about. So hopefully that will help give you some conversation points. And if it turns out that there's no one in the room, then you should be able to come back to the main room and go back into a different group instead.
So I'm going to open the rooms, and you should see a breakout room button at the bottom where you can choose which room you want to go to. If you have questions, I'm going to stay here in the main room. So if anybody wants to come back and be assigned. Yeah. Yeah,
just don't go yet, because I'm about to review what your activity is going to be in your groups. Okay, so let's see. So the idea is in these breakout groups, we've set up a set of slides that have some feeder questions, but feel free to change those as you need. But the idea is that you'll go into a group, you'll identify a note taker who will help putting content into slides, but all of you can contribute, and also a reporter who will share back when you come back to the main room, the outcomes of your group. But you'll review the prompts in the slide and complete the prompts, and then consider along the way that the idea we had for this breakout was first, there's the what, and the what is these topics that we identified at the summer meeting. We have, and those were those 4 categories of like existing efforts, metadata, infrastructure, and citations. And so you'll spend a little bit of time of fleshing out, well, what is that, to make sure everyone has a shared agreement on what that concept is. Then you'll move into a bit of a now what. Okay, now that we know what the topic is, what do we want to do about it? And maybe, and why do we care? What's missing? What hasn't been addressed? And then you'll close with a bit of so what. Okay, so now that we've talked about what the topic is, why we care about it, and what might be needed, what do we actually want to do about it, and how can this group do it? Because that's something to keep in mind too, is with a lot of volunteer efforts, you want to scope the effort into something that is manageable by a group of distributed volunteers, and you don't want to get too grand in the pie in the sky and not be able to accomplish the goal. So the slides are there to help you walk through that conversation, again, of the what's the topic, now why do we care about it, and so what are we doing next? And so some points to consider along that is, again, what is the topic? Maybe that changes a little bit with this group here than it was in the initial setup. What's the priority for the topic? Like, there might be lots of areas that we care about, but what's the thing we want to focus on now? And then what is the action that's manageable by this group? So I'm going to go ahead and add in a link to the 4th breakout here on the slides. But now, once you're ready and you've picked your group, you can go ahead and start moving into those groups. You're going to meet for 25 minutes, and then we're going to return back here to report. Did I miss anything, Val, before we leave?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive.
I think if I go back, okay, now it should be on the screen. Sorry,
I see how to get into the slides. How do I get into the breakout room?
I'm opening them now.
Okay.
Yeah, so you should be able to pick from the bottom by where it says participation, which room you'd like to go into.
Now I see a join a breakout room button.
Yes, that's what you need.
Okay, so yeah, so go ahead and head into your groups, and you'll have 25 minutes to discuss. And if there's no one in that group 4, come back to the main room and try a different group.
Hey, Sarah, can you put in, I'm not getting to the group 4 slides. So can you put it in the chat? I can't copy and paste from the.
Yeah.
Just so I'm prepared to be there.
I also put Val's comment from the chat into the 2nd slide in the notes section there. And I just made a copy of the group 3 ones, so feel free to, again, make any changes that are needed.
Okay. And I'm just having an issue. I'm signed into my other Google account, so I may have to sign off, sign in again. I'm not quite sure what happened there.
Let me make sure the permissions are set so that anybody can access them.
I know it's weird. It's not allowing me to get to Google Slides.
Okay, sorry, now that I've made a copy of it, I changed you should be able to know. Okay.
Let me try again.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If you need the links, they should be in the meeting notes, which I'll put in the chat.
Awesome.
And I'm
Great.
going to head over into group 3.
I'll go to my group now too.
So everyone else who's still in this main room, are you having trouble? Do you need help getting to a breakout session? Do you see the join breakout button at the bottom of your screen? Leslie, you're trying to join group 4, so I'll put you there. Yes, Clint. Was that Clint who was talking?
Yeah, I'm having trouble joining. I'm also going through the web browser. I don't know if that makes a difference, but I can't find
That's okay.
the link.
Which one do you want to be in?
The metadata.
Okay, hopefully that gets you there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Megan.
Hi,
This is Mickey.
Mickey.
I just was late to this because I was getting off another meeting, but not sure where things are at. You can place me in whatever breakout that you'd like.
So it looks like previous efforts is very thin right now. Access to samples, linking, and fair metadata all have quite a few folks, but anything straight to fancy there?
That's fine. The first one that you said.
Okay. Let me move you there. It'll just be you and Val.
All right, thanks.
No, Leslie isn't here. All right, Lindsay, how can I help you get where you'd like to go?
Hi, Megan. Can you put me in fair metadata?
Yes.
Please. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Have a good time. So Leslie.
I'm still here.
There should be a button somewhere that says join because they're already assigned to that room. Can you look and see, is there a pop-up or a something? Because it shows you in that room and it just says not joined. What do you see?
Okay, so when I click on the 4 breakout rooms down the bottom.
Yes. And then there, next to access to samples, if you hover over the space next to it, there should be a join button, I believe.
Oh, I can't. Oh, yeah, got it now.
Great.
Sorry, Megan, maybe I missed it too, but I'm not seeing it either.
Where would you like to be?
I'm just curious, like I'd like to move to 2, but I'm not seeing it. Should it be in Zoom or where should we be seeing it?
Yeah, at the bottom of the screen, there should be a breakouts button, but it might be under more. I unfortunately, I'm not quite sure what your screen looks like.
Okay.
But I can move you there.
Cool, thanks.
Or start to move you there anyways. And then hopefully you'll see something that says join or.
Oh, well, this is.
We weren't quite done.
No, we
I know Dave was just making a wrapping up point.
Yeah, we were just really getting into it. We could do with another couple of hours of discussion there.
We're all being taught discipline.
Yeah, that's the problem though, when you've only got an hour and a half session. And we debated, so what we have scheduled now is to have a recap of every group, 3 minutes, a brief recap, and then to go into a group discussion as a whole on those different findings. Now, since it sounds like everyone was still deep in their topics, do you think it would be worth skipping the group discussion and going back into your individual groups? It's a little problematic in that we won't then be able to hear what in full detail and discuss them as a group, but if it was really necessary, we could adjust the agenda.
No, I would think stay with this schedule because everybody's learning what the others have been doing, and I think we ultimately will find out if working groups are forming and to kind of move forward in the next step to have more extensive discussions within working groups.
Mm-hmm. True, and that's the other thing too that we'll mention when we have the full session wrap up is that we'd like to plan regular monthly calls. And so these are conversations that if they're not closed out here, it's fine because we'll be meeting again soon, like you said. Okay, so I can put up the slide to the links, but do we want to go through the groups in order and have them each do their quick recap? And let me know if you want me to pull up your slides to share them, or if you'd like to share your screen and I could stop.
I can go ahead for group one. We were small but mighty, but had a lot to say. But I think, you know, I don't need to share any slides or anything to really summarize, but I think just our ideas of, you know, tools and future needs. There's all kinds of things about linking samples to repositories and publications and digital repositories that are needed. But the initial thought for that breakout group was to develop a list of, you know, current tools, and perhaps that would be a good and appropriate cluster monthly telecon working session where we may have some sort of a talk about a topic, and then perhaps at the end we can all work together and hammer it out in a shared document to at least start gathering that, because it's a good exercise in order to kind of share with each other what everybody's working on, because that's a need. Yeah. And if anyone else, Anne or Mickey, feels like there's anything else that needs to be said, please do.
Okay. One thought too before we switch to group two is that the RDA physical samples cluster is currently in the, or interest group, sorry, naming conventions, are currently in the process of submitting their session proposal for the next RDA meeting. And I've seen that they want to discuss a webinar series. And so I'd suggested to them that perhaps it could be a partner sponsored event between the two groups as well. And they're also talking about something I'm not sure those of you are familiar with RDA might have heard of, the 23 things. They have a one-pager statement that's 23 things for data management. And so that group is talking about creating some sort of one-page flyer about physical sample resources. And so maybe that could be, again, something this group helps contribute to the outcomes of that group. Okay, so do we want to switch now to group two?
Sure. We didn't get past our first slide. So can you, I don't think I can share. Can you share just slide 2 in the metadata breakout? Just to show some of the notes that we had. We discussed work that's already been done with regards to metadata that's relevant for a variety of different sample types, and came up with a list there and some links to resources. And also work that's currently in progress, like the developing that iSample metadata scheme. And some of the people have been adding some more extensive notes that we didn't necessarily talk about, but there's some information there on work that's going on with ontologies and vocabularies. And then the main thing that we wanted to get out of this is a discussion of what work that we could do as a cluster to develop and promote fair metadata recommendations for physical samples at a high level. And what the top thing I think that came out was that we need to work some on the high level vocabularies to characterize sample types, including the like object type and material, and potentially further classifications. So that could be a specific activity that we do as a cluster. And then also a main thing was describing the context from which a sample was collected, and that varies based on the discipline. So for archaeology, that would be a physical location. It could also include a cultural context. And then for environmental samples, the specific kind of fields that we're thinking about, or and vocabularies that we need, are for the physiographic feature and biome. And then the other main topic was using metadata on sample relationships, and how, like, recommendations for providing metadata at higher levels, like at a site or event level, and how we can use other approaches, like as done in some of the general metadata models, having first describing things like sites and events, and then linking samples to those higher level entities. So I think that covers most of it. Does anyone have anything else to add?
Okay, and I'll share groups 3 slides because that'll give me a second to. We similar to group 1 and 2, we ended up on 1 slide after all this effort, right? But what we did was we talked about different topics and then pulled out some where the needs were, and it actually built really well off of Shelley's presentation. But there's a need for clear practices for including citations in papers, and we need to figure out how that could be machine readable. Once we have these sort of things, you need to figure out how they can be enforced to actually get the authors or the researchers to include such items. And the space where we thought that this group might be able to provide effort would be in giving guidance for different types of samples, what type of acknowledgement should be included and perhaps where. So let's see. It's also worthwhile to have the group develop some basic rules of engagements for citations. So again, how to reference physical samples and the minimum requirements for recommendations, which connects very well to what Joan was talking about with the metadata too, with what fields are important that you need to know about a sample in order to be able perhaps to reuse it or retrieve it. As part of that conversation, we also talked about how there are some limitations of what publishers can support. And so mostly what this group might do would be provide recommendations that could be used going forward, with the idea that whatever needs to be done for legacy stuff is a future ask. So limiting the scope to maybe current recommendations and not necessarily addressing all legacy publications. One issue that's raised that sort of falls within this that we need to consider too is how do you cite large scale collections of samples? So maybe in the research you've got thousands or hundreds of samples that you need to reference. How do you create that citation to that without having to put that 100 times into an article? That's a little bit problematic. Let's see. It's also tricky to focus on the sample. At some point too, you might be in the paper, you're referencing the data about the sample, and then that links back to the sample. So that creates these different levels of connection, and is that the right way to be considering it? And again, that goes to what recommendations we might make to authors on what they should be including in their citations. Some of the other things that came up were a discussion about how Scholix exists, but it's limited to DOIs, and could there possibly be a hub for samples that uses existing identifiers to make connections between different resources. And then as we were closing, Dave was bringing up the point that it's important to have identifiers preserved at, and I believe you were going to say at the different points in the life cycle. But does that address well what we talked about in our group? Oops. Let's go back now then to group 4. Do you need me to share your slides?
Kirsten, do you want to do a summary or do you want me to do it?
It's up to you. I'm happy to do it, but I'm also happy for you to do it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You can go ahead. I'm happy to let you do it.
Okay, then I better pull them up somewhere.
Yeah, Sarah, if you Sarah can share. Do you want to pop them up?
Yeah.
And also, we were the same way. We have stuff on slides 1, and then I think 4 and 5.
Well, I think because for me at least it was a surprise to actually have that session, and so it was a little less defined, and I think we all needed to wrap our mind around it a little bit. So what we talked about under what work has been done is ended up actually being a list of digital resources that provide access to samples. But much less, it was less about the physical infrastructure. But we then discussed, what is really important, the policies for sample access and, open access. And so we had some of the group actually talk about the policies for their repositories, such as the USGS core repositories, that they do have open access but require data to be submitted to the repository afterwards. We talked a little bit about the whole issue of costs for making samples open access, that currently the repositories and their host institutions are carrying the burden of the costs, at least for small sharing efforts, that large requests for large collections are otherwise funded. What I also consider relevant is we talked about the oversight of access to samples, because some samples are so special, so limited in material, that there are committees that actually make decisions about who gets a sample and how much this was. We had the examples of Geoscience Australia for some of their collections and the Apollo collection there. So I think what we ended up with is saying that, consistent policies for the preservation of samples would help. Obviously, talking about space is a big issue that needs to be addressed, and how that is funded. And yeah, that falls into that category of long-term resources that support a sample access infrastructure. We did not manage to talk at all about sort of the what does an individual investigator do to ensure long-term preservation and so on. So I think there are a lot of open issues. Can you go to the third slide? Yeah, which was, we talked, a little bit about what could we do, and we can definitely connect with other groups in ESIP, especially with the data stewardship group, but there is other groups that are important for the physical aspects of the sample access. And RDA is one of the groups, but something like the Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections has a lot of influence on the level of policy setting. And I am not familiar with the Museum Computer Network. But I think where we converged to at the end of the session is that we do need to raise the attention to this issue of the physical infrastructure and its resources, the demands on institutions and their responsibilities for ensuring open access to whatever collections they host. So my suggestion in the end was that we should work on a white paper that at least defines the scope of a potential working group on these issues of physical infrastructure.
Great. So that it sounds like that group went well. I'm glad, Alex, you were able to lead that, and sorry for putting you on the spot like this too.
Oh yeah, me and Kirsten kind of tag teamed it, so it was a good
yeah,
experience.
Thank you, Kirsten, too. Thank you. Okay. All right, so because we ended up with 4 groups and we needed a little bit more discussion about that, we've gotten a little bit off time, but now we wanted to have about 10 minutes now to talk about the community discussion. So specifically, it sounds like we've got some directions or some clear objectives from each of the groups, but perhaps those of you who were not able to attend the session, you also want to provide some breakout, you want to provide some opinions on if you had any suggestions or discussion points on those. If you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself, or let me see if I can, or raise your hand. We can call you.
Powers, can I go ahead?
Yeah.
There have been a couple of pretty high-profile government level reports that have come out recently on the management of scientific collections, and also a recent report was published on kind of the return on investment on scientific collections. I think everybody should read these resources, because I think that they're providing the framework for building a lot of momentum to be investing in the infrastructure for collections. You know, NSF is pretty heavily invested. I mean, they sponsored the National Academy study. There's also a study out of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, I think they are. There is a heavy focus on biological samples, but certainly they're covering all aspects of samples. And I think there are recommendations put forward in these reports that could help frame our efforts as well. And let me see if I can find links and put them in the chat.
Was it the Endless Frontier, the next 75 years in science? Or trying to find, sorry, searching through my email to find the AIBS report. That might not be it.
That's not it, but I'll dig them up. I've got them bookmarked, I think. Oh, except that I just erased all my bookmarks in Chrome this morning. So it may take me a minute, but I'll put them in.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else want to add any other perspective or comments?
With respect to the citation group, just knowing that GBIF has been really working closely with publishers, I think that's, you know, again, we should make an effort to really pull the biological community into what we're trying to achieve.
I believe there's a session later this week on biological data standards, perhaps. That might be, but in general, I think that's another cluster we might want to connect with to see how best we might align.
That's a good point. Yep.
For citations, there's also the RDA data collections. I don't know if anyone here is involved in that, but it seems like that could be something to connect with, and a group to connect with, and thinking about how to cite large numbers of samples.
I had popped the, oops, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I had popped the Museum Computer Network into our Access PowerPoint as we were talking about accessing during COVID, because they've had a lot of work on how cultural museums are maintaining access to their objects during COVID. So that might be a partner that has some ideas for things we can think about with physical space management, questions like that.
And that's in the notes for group 4 already?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so as we start to close up this conversation, we're still, it sounds like, forming concepts, but I think we're getting there. Are there any any next steps that we want to determine here in the room for any of these particular activities? And also, are there any ones who want to step up and say that they'll possibly lead one of these tasks? Not to put everybody on the spot, but this is definitely something that we can continue on in conversation once we go to the cluster meetings. And then also we have a cluster mailing list, which I'll put up on the slides later, a link to for you to join so that we can continue some of these conversations offline. And I see Lindsay shared some resources in the chat. We can definitely add those to the meeting notes.
Should we discuss like the format for meeting in the future, and like this, some of the like how we want to work on these specific areas, like working groups or?
Yeah, what we had originally thought was that we would have monthly calls and that we would have space during those calls to then do some of these activities. And it might be dependent on how, if the working groups are all made up of the same people, I mean, we could do it as a group. If the working groups need to have individual meetings, that also works. But did you have any particular ideas you wanted to share, Joan, on that?
I mean, we could do groups like we've organized today that seem to make sense to us in organizing this session, and kind of alternate like meetings. That's just the first thing that comes to mind, like alternate the groups by each month. Or maybe we want to focus on one thing. It's something that we could discuss, like if there's a particular area you think that we need to focus on first, maybe particularly thinking about how we can provide better recommendations to publishers, as Shelley brought up. So what would be the priority, like first focusing on the identifier recommendations or some specific metadata recommendations, and how that might guide what we do first.
So I might just insert a brief comment here. In my role, I get to observe the work of a lot of different ESIP collaboration areas. And just one general tip is, I think when you're first starting out, it's better to think about, like you're doing now, what are all the things we might care about and want to work on, and think about sequencing them, and potentially, you know, until you're really sure that you have a lot of people interested, different people interested in those different tasks, not fragmenting your group or putting too much on any one person. So I think you have to make hard choices about what you want to do first, but I think that would be my advice, is to do it in sequence rather than to break into multiple groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so thinking about the different tasks that might come out of this too. So with the first group, there's the idea of identifying existing resources, developing potentially a webinar series or other sort of assessment. With the second group, there was coming up with some metadata recommendations and forming some topic work around that, which I think relates to there's another ESIP session, which I've got listed in the slides, that might go into that with the documentation cluster. With the third group, there's definitely the linking and citations. There's definitely that connection with the publishers and some efforts there. And with infrastructure, there's this idea of perhaps a white paper. So does any one of those feel like we should do this now? We could get it done fast as a group. This is what we should focus on first. Any votes on these topics?
I kind of like the idea of thinking about recommendations for publishers, like starting at like what we absolutely need to get across to the broadest community. And I think that the first thought that I think of for that is recommendations for identifiers and high-level metadata. But that's
I'd support that as well, because we've kind of done it for data, software's done it. So like, I think there's a need there for that as a priority.
Yep, I agree.
I agree.
The publisher, because, and again, the other thing to me is once you have the publishers aligned, as we found with data, then you really do bring the researchers on board.
So this would be something to really do in collaboration with Coptis, with the Coptis cluster.
And also, I might have only mentioned this in our breakout group, but also there's the research artifact citations group that is working on some recommendations. Yes. And so we might be able to partner with them as well. And I've got a link to that later in the slides, but they're working on recommendations for when do you give credit. So it might not only be just in the publication to the sample, but do you also provide credit to other things like the curator who helped manage the sample. So we might incorporate some of that concept as well.
And I'd also add, if that credit work goes ahead, that's going to be a game changer, because it means that, you know, the person who actually collected the sample will be recorded against it. and it'll go with the sample. And I think that's particularly important for like institutions that are supporting the preservation of the sample or the collection of the sample, because they'll finally get recognition.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like the identifier just helps to track all of these issues. So for even access to samples, if you have identifiers, you have a much easier way to access samples. So we kept kind of linking back to, you know, digitizing is the issue when it comes to accessing samples, since we all kind of do it differently throughout the community. So I agree.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like we've got a good momentum towards this first topic. And so once we, let me advance the slides and let's start moving into some of this wrapping up the stuff. Let's see. Sorry, I have too many things open on the screen with the chat and things. We'll come back to this takeaways for ESIP. But one of the things we would like you all to do is to sign up for the physical samples cluster listserv. That's that first link. And so then we can communicate with there. We'll provide a summary of what we think the next step is for this group to that list. And we'll also send out a poll to identify a regular meeting time for that group. And make discussions from there on how we'll meet and what connections to make. And maybe from there, we can invite folks from COPTEST to join us at that meeting, and maybe the folks from the research artifact group as well to join, so that we can have some collaboration and discussion on what the outcomes might look like. Let's see. And asking for the links to be added to the, oh, someone else has got it. All right. I think someone's pasting it in there now. Okay. Trying to think. Oh, yes. The second one is to make sure you've actually put your name into the notes document. That's the second link that's there. And then keep an eye out moving forward for any advertisements that we have, again, to either join the meeting and take part in the conversations, or to share your thoughts by email. Okay, so I also want to share, sorry, it's hard to copy and paste and talk at the same time. I also want to share these two other sessions that I mentioned. There is an Innovating in Documentation Ecosystems discussion on Wednesday, and the times here are listed in Eastern, and then Managing Session Credit for Research Artifacts on Thursday. Did you guys want to give a brief pitch for the documentation ecosystem session? I know a number of you who are taking part of that are here in the room. I don't hear anyone speaking up, but I believe they're going to continue.
Sorry, I can.
Oh, go ahead.
Just getting off the mute here. So this Innovating in a Documentation Ecosystem is really about tools and documentations where we're kind of building on existing, sort of, we're not starting from scratch. And I think it's really pretty cool being able to take notes and compare existing tools, just kind of harness on those instead of working in our same silos that we keep working on and building new tools for it. And I don't know if Joan or Lindsay wanted to contribute to that, but I think it'll be a cool session if you guys want to join, and certainly relevant for this group as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're really looking at, you know, how do we connect things broadly across ecosystems with a strong focus on reusing capabilities that have already been developed and incorporating them into tools and sample and collection management infrastructure.
Great, thank you. I'm looking forward to the session, so you'll see me there, but hopefully you'll see a bunch of other folks there as well. So one final thing that ESIP has asked, and I like that they do this, is they ask for some takeaways to be captured from the sessions, and then later after the winter meeting is over, there'll be another meeting where everyone shares, or hopefully they'll do it again this year, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, like a brief 1-minute summary of here's what happened at our session. And so these are the guidelines that they give towards capturing that. But any thoughts or anything in particular anyone wanted to share that they wanted as a takeaway from this session? Say my main takeaways is that there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm, and again, that's great to see carried over from the summer session, and very active participation. And we were able to come up with some concrete ideas of where we'd like to go in the future, and pick one to highlight, to focus on as a group. And I think we've already have identified external and internal groups we might partner with on that effort, and we're making plans to move forward. So I think that would be my summary, but I didn't know if anyone else had anything they wanted to share. All right, well, if not, then it looks like we're right at time. I'm highly impressed with us. We managed to get through our entire agenda and keep to time. And I think we got through everything that we wanted to talk about. And like I said, we have some concrete options and plans for moving forward. So thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to future engagements.
All right, thank you. Good session.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Shelley, for contributing.
Yes, thank you, Shelley.
Oh, thank you guys. This is really fantastic, and I'm quite delighted with all the help you're going to give journals. Thanks.